You're doing well. This is a review video for exam 4, which is chapters 54, 55, and 57. If you see that I am adding extra notes or highlighting anything, go ahead and do that on your PowerPoint just because that's something that probably will be emphasized in your exam, so just keep that in mind. Let's go ahead and start with chapter 54, Ecology of Individuals and Populations. We'll start off with a definition of ecology, and there's two parts to ecology. So the first part is the study of how organisms relate to one another. That's the first part. And the second part is how organisms are influenced by the environment. And so that's why ecology is kind of a complex field of study. And when we're speaking about the environment is something that is abiotic and has abiotic factors. Abiotic means that it is non-living. So abiotic examples could be temperature, water, sunlight, and soil. These are all abiotic factors that influence organisms. Another definition that you might be familiar with is something that we call homeostasis. And so they have it as an individual must maintain a steady state internal environment regardless of the external environment. A very popular example is how humans are able to stay at a temperature of around 98 degrees Fahrenheit. That does depend on each individual. Not everybody is that temperature, but that's what we consider an example of homeostasis, that you stay at that 98 degrees Fahrenheit despite it being hot or cold around you. That's not always the case, right? If it's in an extreme environment, then yes, your body temperature will change. But yeah, this is what we consider to be homeostasis. And so here they kind of give you an example of how some animals can adapt. It says that the beetle collects water to help live in a dry environment, or you can have what we call conformers that adopt temperature, salinity of their surroundings. So responses, they can either be short or long term. An example of short term is something that is within a few minutes. Long term is something that's going to take a long time. Natural selection, we discussed it before, is something that can take within a human lifetime maybe 20 to 40 years. So that's what they consider long term here. Some coping mechanisms. We have three. We have the physiological responses, morphological, and behavioral responses. And let's go ahead and give you some examples. So for physiological, they have some examples of sweating, so that if you are hot, your body will sweat to cool you off. That's a physiological response. Morphological is like the appearance, right? Morphology is the appearance of an animal. So here it says thick fur coats during the winter. And so they're speaking about animals that have a thicker coat in the winter, and then they're able to shed their coat once it starts to get warmer. Behavioral response is that a really good example for behavioral responses is moving from one habitat to another. And this could be like the birds that migrate, that they are in a really cold environment and then they migrate to a place that's much warmer. That's what we consider a behavioral response. They have some more examples here. Here's another behavioral response. And so we have a lizard, and as you may know, they're considered to be what's called cold-blooded. So they cannot actually have a temperature like how we're able to self-regulate. They cannot. They rely solely on the sun actually to be warm. So if he is cold, like over here, he could be in the shade somewhere. All that he has to do is move over to a rock or wherever it is where there's full sunlight, and then he's able to what we call sunbathe, and so that his body temperature can go ahead and rise. So that's a behavioral response. A morphological response is like we mentioned here. They have a wolf, and so it mentions the thickness of the fur. When it's really cold, it has a much thicker coat, and when it's warm, it has a less thick coat. Environmental conditions. So we spoke about natural selection, and so there's something really unique called Allen's rule. Right, and so Allen's rule, it's reduced surface area, and so this is that animals have either short ears or short limbs in colder climates. And so I added these pictures here so you can kind of see it a little bit better. I have two types of bears. I have the polar bear and then I have a grizzly bear. And so the grizzly bear has larger ears, whereas the polar bear has smaller ears. And that's because the polar bear is in a very, very cold environment and the grizzly bear is in a, I guess, lesser cold environment. And so you have smaller ears, or you would have smaller ears because a lot of your body heat escapes through your ears. And so that's why, like, even for us, that we cover our ears. I can't even think of what the fabric is called. Is it ear warmers? I'm not sure. But we cover our ears because we do lose a lot of heat through them. And so for these animals, uh, the adaptation that they have is that their ears are actually just smaller in general so that they lose less body heat. Same thing for the examples here of these two rabbits. Much larger ears in a warmer climate and then much smaller ears in a colder environment. So that again is Allen's rule. Okay, so we're speaking about populations now, which are groups of individuals in one place and time. Three characteristics are the range, and then the spacing, and then how the population changes in size through time. And so we're going to go through each of those. So when we speak about the range, that's like where the animal can live, and says for most species it's limited. And so this fish is like a very specific habitat that it needs. It says the devil's hole pupfish lives in a single spring in southern Nevada, and that's the only place that it lives. But you can have changes in a range that could be influenced by the environment. And it says here that humans have expanded ranges of coyotes and introduced starlings. So it can change. If they do have suitable habitat, then the range is able to change. This is an example of glaciers that melted. That's why it says glaciers retreated. So glaciers melted, and because of that, you had more suitable habitat for these trees to kind of move in and fill in those holes. Another example is the cattle egret, which is a bird. We have them here in the Rio Grande Valley. They're white and they follow the cattle around. You may have seen them before. But so it says that they used to be just here in Southern America and have now just migrated, right? And so once they find suitable habitat, then they're able to move there. Another way that you can have suitable habitat is from the plants going there, but how can plants just show up? One of the ways is that plants are able to disperse their fruits or their seeds. And so there's different dispersal patterns. The fruit is a common one, but you can also have these. Asclepias is a milkweed, and they kind of have a like fiber, really, really fine and very, very soft. It's really interesting, but these types of seeds are able to get caught in the wind and then move somewhere else. And then we have these, like the stickers or spinas that you may know, that it says adherent fruit. So they kind of stick on something and then are able to move somewhere else. So very interesting. So that's another way that plant ranges can expand. When we're talking about spacing, there's three types of spacings. There is random, there is uniform, and there is clumped. And I inserted a picture for you so that you can kind of see it a little bit better. So clumped, a good example is elephants. Another good example would be like wolves, how wolves are in packs. Same for elephants. Elephants like to be with their family. Uniform is when everything is, I don't know another word for uniform, but when they're all just identical placement somewhat, I guess, in a row. So that's an example of uniform. And then random is, well, that's random. So they have just random flowers all over a prairie. So those are the three types of spacing patterns: random, uniform, and clumped. When we're speaking about demographics, you may have heard this term in something other than biology, maybe in like a sociology class, a statistics class, I can't, maybe history. Typically, examples of demographics would be like ethnicity, race, but it also varies too. You can have Like I know in the schools, they will kind of put kids into different categories, and those are also considered demographics. So, but we use this, it's to study populations and then also how they change through time. So there's examples here, whole population, if it's increasing, decreasing, or if it's staying the same. And then it says population broken down into parts. We can study birth and death rates of a specific age. And so this is like an example of how we use demographics. It could be influenced by sex ratio, number of births directly related to number of females. And then we have what's called generation times, the average interval between birth of an individual and the birth of its offspring. And so that's something that can be influenced. This is really important for you to understand survivorship and survivorship curves. So this is what we call the survivorship curve, and there's 3 of them here. I have type 1, and you know what, let me see if I can, that's a picture, but let's try and highlight. That's a type 1 survivorship curve. This is a type 2 survivorship curve and type 3 survivorship curve. Let's see if I can unselect now. Perfect. Okay. So these are the 3 types of survivorship curves, and they give you examples. Type 1 is a human, and so what you're seeing is that a human, well actually let's go over the x-axis and y-axis first. So the x-axis is the percent of maximum lifespan. So, and then the other side, proportion of surviving. For humans, it says that they have a high survival rate and they live a long time, right? Which is typical of humans, right? That you will have 1 to 2 babies, and for the most part, they're going to live. And you nurture them, you take care of them, they live a long time, and then here it shows that they all kind of die around the same age. So between 75 and 100 years old is when humans just start to die off. So that's a type 1 survivorship curve. These are going to be animals that have very few offspring. Humans are a good example. Bison, buffalo, elephants, I'm trying to think of other animals, dolphins. Animals that have very few offspring are going to be a type 1 curve. Type 2 curve are animals that just, they can die at any point in their life, that they're constantly in threat. So examples of this are like, here they have hydra, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with what a hydra is. They're kind of, they look like miniature squid or miniature octopus. But if you're unfamiliar with the hydra, that's okay. A good example is like birds, songbirds specifically. So songbirds are always threatened because they have, well, for one, they have a habitat loss. So they have like, they're really hurt bad by habitat loss. But then the other thing is that there are a lot of predators around, specifically cats. So a bird will have her eggs and her babies hatch, and then they are susceptible to dying from a cat, a snake, not sure what else. It could be another bird too, like an owl, so things like that. But so birds, all their life, are just at this constant threat of dying, and so they're a really good example of survivorship 2 curve. Survivorship 3 are animals that have a lot of offspring typically. So they have a lot of offspring and they just kind of have a short life for the most part. These are going to be animals that have, well, here they have the example of an oyster. Another example could be like insects, how insects just have so many babies. And then out of all those babies, just a few survive. And then those also don't really live out a long life. They probably also die relatively young. So that's going to be type 3. Typically those are smaller animals, actually like very small is a good example. Well, there's I guess one exception that I'm thinking of that's a little bit bigger. Really good example of this also are sea turtles. Sea turtles, she will lay a lot of eggs, and then they all hatch for the most part, I believe. But then only a few of them actually make it, right? Because they're all fighting to go into the ocean, and then they all get picked off by birds. So that's another good example. Survival of offspring. It says balance between number of offspring and the size of the offspring. Larger offspring have a greater chance of survival, right? Producing many small offspring may result in very low survival rates. So again, large offspring would be humans, bison, elephants, dolphins, and then animals that have small offspring may result in low survival rates. We spoke about the birds before, and so what a clutch size is like the amount of babies that she has, and the offspring size is how big it is. And so this is just kind of saying that if she has less babies, that the babies, the less, or yes, that's correct, that she, if she has less baby birds, those baby birds grow up to be or are bigger because she's not having to feed, all of these babies. She only has a few babies that she can feed properly, and they can grow bigger, and they now have a higher chance of survival. So kind of keep that in mind. If animals do need to are really dependent on the mother, it's best that the mother has just a few offspring. Age at first reproduction correlates with the lifespan. Long-lived species delay reproduction. And I mean, this isn't by choice, right? This is just kind of like a matter of fact. Like, you don't reach sexual maturity until you're older. And so longer lived species have that trait where their gestation, or not gestation, but sexual maturity takes a lot longer, and also gestation is also longer. Um, Here it says an advantage. Juveniles gain experience before the high cost of reproduction. And then here it says that short-lived species reproduce early. They are able to get to sexual maturity at a much younger age. So now we're kind of getting more into the math portion of how it is that they're able to calculate population sizes and kind of also make predictions as well. So populations often remain the same size regardless of the number of offspring born. And so here's what we call exponential growth. And so an exponential growth model applies to populations that have no growth limits. And in a little bit, I'll show you on a graph so you can kind of see that. And then here they give you the formula and then what those stand for. It says R is the rate of populations increase, B is the birth rate, D is the death rate, I is immigration, and E is emigration. So animals coming into the population and animals coming out. It's a very important slide and term. Carrying capacity. The biotic potential of any population is exponential even when the rate of increase remains constant. Result of unchecked exponential growth is a population explosion, but all populations eventually reach some limit imposed by a shortage. And so carrying capacity is symbolized by K. Go ahead and bold and underline that. Carrying capacity is symbolized by K, is the maximum number of individuals that an environment can support. And so now let's go ahead and look at the graph. So the exponential growth, they said, was limitless growth. And so that's represented by the red line here. The population is just growing, 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 and it doesn't look like it's going to stop. So that is what we call exponential growth. Now the one in blue is the logistic growth. And so this dotted line here is what's called the carrying capacity, and that's represented by K, the letter K. So animals cannot go past the carrying capacity. If they go past the carrying capacity, it will fall. And so what the carrying capacity is, it's a limit. So this could be limited space, limited food. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head, but it's limited resources. So once that population hits the carrying capacity, it has run out of something and the population will decrease. But if you notice that there is kind of always, even with logistic growth, there is a part that is exponential. So like from here to here, this is exponential growth. and then it keeps going. It starts to go down once it gets closer to the carrying capacity. This is a very important slide, so please make sure that you kind of read over it and just remember that you know these terms: the carrying capacity, exponential growth, and logistic growth curves. Another thing that I really wanted to mention, and I think I had it somewhere here, maybe not. I think I have it in another slide. So, but I haven't gotten to that yet, so I'll wait. But yes, please consider looking over that slide again. We have N and K. And so N is the number of individuals, which I think I had it in this slide. N is the number of individuals right here. You do need to know that, so let's go ahead and highlight that. N is the number of individuals, and then you all know what K was. K was the carrying capacity. So as N approaches K, the rate of the population growth begins to slow. So as the number of individuals approaches the carrying capacity, the rate of the population growth begins to slow down. And so it slows down because of what we mentioned earlier, that they're losing access to resources. Some examples of animals showing logistic growth. We have, looks like a seal, and then I'm not 100% sure, but that looks like a Daphnia. I'm pretty sure that is a Daphnia. So it's a little bit easier to see with this one because it's a really pretty graph. But so all these dots are the populations, and so you kind of see they're kind of scattered everywhere, and then they have a best fit line. But if you notice, you have these kind of spurts. You have, it goes up and then it goes down. It goes up, down, down. So once it reaches the carrying capacity, it kind of crashes. Same thing here. It goes back up and then it crashes down. Over here you can see it too with the Daphnia, how it had this really big exponential growth. It hit the carrying capacity and then it crashes back down. So that's kind of how that works. Density dependent and independent. So these are factors that influence the population size. So dependent and independent. Density dependent factors that affect the population and depend on the population size. Independent are other factors such as natural disasters that can affect populations regardless of size. And then I included this because I really liked this image. I know it's a little bit blurry, but it still sends a good message. So it says limiting factors, any biotic or abiotic factors that cause a decrease in the population growth. And so we have examples of density dependent are competition, predation, parasitism, and disease. And then density independent would be like, it says human disturbances, but another example could be fires, hurricanes, volcanoes. I'm trying to think of other ones, floods, things like that. So those would be density independent. This is what we call a predator-prey relationship. And so this means that you have two different species that kind of, well, one needs the other one. Well, I guess they both kind of need each other, and I'll kind of explain why. So what happens is we have the hare, which is this rabbit, and the lynx. And so we kind of see these trends of these animals. And so when the population of the hare increases, the population of the lynx also increases because the lynx has something to eat. And so they're very happy, they're healthy, they're reproducing. And so both of them, when they both go up, it's kind of a, I guess, a win, maybe not a win for him, but it's a win for the cat. But when you see that the population decreases also with the rabbit, you will also see a decrease in the hare because his food source is now gone. And so that's kind of why you see these trends. They kind of follow each other. So predators, they have their place, right? If you had, let's say if you didn't have the lynx and you just had the hare and there was just so many hare and they weren't being regulated, that could influence other animals, right? So maybe this hare is eating, I don't know, this special plant that another animal really, really is dependent on. But because there's so many rabbits and it's eating all of that vegetation, other animals now are getting hurt by that. So they kind of have like a checks and balances system. Resource availability. Resource availability affects life history adaptations. When resources are limited, the cost of reproduction is high. Selection will favor individuals that can compete and utilize resources efficiently. And then K-selected species, let's go ahead and highlight that. K-selected species are adapted to thrive when the population is near its carrying capacity. I'm going to highlight all of that. So let me go back really quickly. So again, K-selected species, they thrive when it's near the carrying capacity. So if it is a K-selected species, when it's in this area, that's a population that is thriving. And so let's go back. Here we go. And so let's give you examples. What are K-selected populations? So K-selected populations, an example would be like humans. Another example that we mentioned would be the elephants, the hippopotamus. I'm trying to think of other really large whales. Those are all K-selected species, and those they thrive around the carrying capacity. So we have what's called R and K selected species. Let me get my highlighter out. Right? So K and R selected species. And so this shows you the differences between them. I think we've already established with the K selected species. They more than likely have a stable environment. They're larger. Energy used to make individuals is high. So this means that they care for their young for a long time too. Elephants, they will have their calf for several years. Same with humans, same with whales. So there's a lot of energy invested into that baby. They have less offspring. They have a long life typically. They reproduce more than once. They are typically density dependent and they follow type 1 or type 2 survivorship curves. So these again are the survivorship curves. This is survivorship curve 1, 2, and 3. For R selected species, they have an unstable environment. They're typically small. They don't really invest a lot of energy into their offspring. They have a lot of offspring and they mature very early. They have a short life. They reproduce maybe only once, right? That's like their like cockroaches. I actually don't know how often cockroaches reproduce. I hope it's not that often, but they reproduce less in their lifetime. They're typically density independent and they follow the type 3 survivorship curve, which is this one, right? So, okay. This slide is it's same, this kind of the same. The R and the K selected species, and then it gives you pretty much what we just went over, and I don't think I see anything that is different from that other slide. Some traits of K-selected species, which we already mentioned. So let's see. Let's go into the human part. So human populations have grown exponentially. So that's like limitless, right? That humans are just kind of growing and there seems to be no limits because we're just kind of finding alternatives. If there's no food, we'll make food, I guess. So we kind of have a limitless population, so that's why we have exponential growth. The birth rate has remained unchanged, the death rate has fallen dramatically. So people are living for a long time. It says Earth's rapidly growing human population constitutes perhaps the greatest challenge to the future of the biosphere. And then here it kind of tells you why there's uneven distribution among countries, an increasing gap between the rich and the poor, which I won't highlight, but we'll kind of talk about why this is like the social part of this. because there is such an imbalance between the rich and the poor, typically people that are rich are able to influence society much more. So anything that they are really going for as far as ideals or anything that's really in their favor, they have a lot of power because they are able to influence um, people with it could be like money, or I can't really think of another reason. But that's typically what we see. And so having this really big gap, it kind of hurts us because then these people over here, these rich people, are kind of running everything when this is not the majority of people. The majority of people are not rich, and so that's why it's an issue. The world ecosystem is already under stress. What is K for the human population? So what is the carrying capacity, right, for the human population? When is it that we're going to see a crash, is what this is saying. And here's a suggested reading. Let's go ahead and move on to chapter 55, community ecology. So a community are species that occur at a particular place. Let's go ahead and highlight that, which is characterized by species richness, primary productivity, and it says that interactions among members govern many ecological and evolutionary processes. This picture is a really nice picture, just like everybody looks very happy. Everyone's at the watering hole. We have wildebeest, giraffes. I'm not sure what those birds are, but and zebras in the background. Is there anything that I'm missing? That maybe that's a water buffalo. A lot of animals just having a good time there. We have what's called a niche. And so what a niche is the total of all the ways an organism uses resources in the environment. And there's different types of niches, which I don't think I have included here, but just kind of know that there are different types. And so here are the examples for that. And let's kind of go into resource partitioning. I wonder if I can make this a little bit bigger for you. Can I see that? Can't really see what's going on. Resource partitioning. So I have a palm tree and another tree over there, but I'm assuming this is supposed to be, maybe possibly not. But anyway, so I have a tree, and so it's showing that I have lizards that are living on different parts of the tree. And so that's how they're able to kind of coexist, is because they have taken on a niche, right? They have a specific part where they're able to thrive and they don't have to compete with other animals. And so this is probably really important right here. It's subdivided niche to avoid direct competition. So once you lessen competition, everybody is happy, nobody's fighting for resources or space, and so we can all survive and not have to lessen in population sizes. Prey populations. It says prey populations can have explosions and crashes. An example is the white-tailed deer in the eastern U.S. And so I know for the deer, for hunting, there's a lot of regulations on when you can hunt and when you can't, just so that we kind of protect this species. I know that there's actually quite a bit, though. I'm not familiar with why they're kind of speaking about the eastern U.S., like if they were really hurt in that part, but that is interesting. If you do know, let me know if white-tailed deer are kind of absent in the eastern U.S. It says introduction of dogs, rats, and cats on islands. We spoke about the cats and how harmful they are to birds. So if you have a cat, they really advise that you keep the cat inside because they really are hurting our bird populations. And then here it says New Zealand. Stephen Island wren, extinct because of a single cat. So a wren is a type of bird. So this bird went extinct because of one cat. That's actually really sad. Accidentally moved that. Excuse me. Predation and coevolution. Predation provides strong selective pressures on prey populations. Selective pressures, we had an example in another PowerPoint where we had two animals that looked almost identical but were not the same animal, and that was, I think it was a dolphin and a shark, and we had mentioned why they look the same, and we said it's because of what we call selective pressures. They have the same selective pressures, they live in the same environment, they have the same pressures put against them, so that's why we use that term selective pressures. Predation provides strong selective pressure on the prey population. Plants as prey. Plants adapt to predation by evolving mechanisms to defend themselves. If you have an invasive species, so this is a species that did not evolve in the same area as like a plant, and a really good example, I believe, is called the cactus moth. Let me check really quickly. I'll let you know why I'm talking about the cactus moth. Okay. Kind of hard on a little screen. Give me 1 second. All right. So I'm speaking about the cactus that we have here in Texas. I'm sure you all have seen them. This is a picture of what they look like, right? This is the cactus that I'm speaking about. And so they have thorns, right? And so this cactus has the thorns to protect itself, right? And so it would be protecting itself from like a horse, a cow, right? Something really big. But what it didn't think of, or it doesn't think, but what it didn't evolve to protect itself was from something like this, something so small, right? So this is the caterpillar for a moth. And so what this moth does is it lays its eggs, and then the babies just kind of ruin the entire cactus. I'm trying to find a picture of it. So this plant did not evolve to kind of withstand an attack like this, and so that's why invasive species can be really detrimental to actually any species. And so that brings us back to this, right? Plants adapt to predation, herbivory, by evolving mechanisms to defend themselves. But when you have something like an invasive species that isn't supposed to be there, plants can really take a hit from it because they had never seen that before in their whole life, right? In their whole millions of years that they've been there, and then all of a sudden there's this species that is not supposed to be there and really can harm them. So kind of keep that in mind. It says here, herbivores co-evolve to continue eating plants. Some chemical defenses in animals. So some animals are poisonous, as you may know, and so a really good example here is the monarch butterfly. We talk about it frequently. The monarch butterfly feeds on milkweed, which is a plant, probably one of my favorite flowering plants. Feeds on milkweed and other dogbane families. And so once it eats that plant, then the monarch becomes poisonous. So again, the monarch will eat this plant. The plant is poisonous, and so now the butterfly, or what is it called? Caterpillar, is now poisonous. And so these birds, once they eat them, they get sick. They're not going to die, but they get sick and they kind of throw it up. And so monarchs incorporated this so that it's a protection from predation. So because of that, we have what's called mimicry, right? Copying, right? You're copying. Mimicry allows one species to capitalize on defense strategies of others. There's two specific mimicries that we need to learn. There's what we call Batesian and the Mullerian mimicry. It says here that it mimics distasteful species, and then Mullerian, several unrelated but poisonous species come to resemble one another. And let's kind of give more examples. So here I included this just so that you can kind of see it, but I want you to look at this photo really quick. We spoke about the monarch butterfly and how the monarch butterfly is poisonous because it eats a poisonous plant. And so now, because of the success of this butterfly, you have other species of butterfly that are mimicking that because they want to also not be eaten, right? They don't want to be eaten by birds. And so their best defense is to look like an animal that is poisonous. And so that's why you kind of have these copying things that's going on. And so here it says here that contrary to early belief, the viceroy, which is this one, the viceroy and the monarch butterflies exhibit Mullerian mimicry, not Batesian. So Mullerian is that they are both poisonous, right? They're both poisonous. And so why is it that that benefits them both is because both are poisonous. The birds, if the birds see them, the birds already know, like, oh no, I can't eat those. Those are the ones that hurt my stomach. And so that's a really good example of Mullerian mimicry. An example of Batesian mimicry is where one is harmful or poisonous and the other one is not. And so the one that is not is here, the king snake. So the king snake is mimicking this venomous animal, the coral snake. And so he is not venomous, but he's copying him because he wants to be avoided, right? When people see this, they get really scared. They're like, oh, no, I don't want to be around that venomous snake. And so they kind of avoid him. And typically, because of that, the snake has time to get away. And so this animal over here, the king snake, is not venomous, but is taking the benefits of looking venomous. And so that's why it's a successful species. Defensive coloration, and the term is not here, I need to add it. But so animals can have bright colors as a defense. They can also be camouflaged. But animals that are brightly colored, right, like these, like we mentioned, they're brightly colored. Same with the monarch. Monarch is like these really bright, flashy, like warning colors, like stay away from me, I'm harmful, I will hurt you. And so that's a defense, that they're bright looking. And so they're called warning coloration, right? And so this is called aposematic coloration. So aposematic coloration is those warning colors. Warning, stay away. I will hurt you. Get away from me. So that's a good example. Aposematic coloration, warning colors. Same here. Warning colors, yellow and black, very bright, contrasting a lot. They're poisonous. Stay away from me. So this is an example of aposematic coloration. And so now we're going to go into the types of symbiosis. And there's a few of them. And I know you know this one. So mutualism is when both of the species benefit. And so here I think they have, it says the ants and then the acacia is the plant. And that both of them are getting something out of this relationship. Both of them benefit. And so this is mutualistic. This is a mutualistic relationship. Another symbiotic relationship is parasitism. So parasitism, when one benefits at the expense to the other. So one is benefiting and one is benefiting and one is being harmed. This one, mutualism, both are benefiting. So both are benefiting. Here, one is benefiting and one is getting harmed. And an example that they have here is it's a deer that eats an ant, and then the poor deer gets worms. And so what happens is that the worm is inside the ant, and so when the deer comes to eat the grass, it accidentally eats the ant, and then now it's infected with flatworms. If you have pets, I'm sure you have gotten your dog or your cat dewormed. And so like when they poop, their poop has all these white small worms, and that's from this, right? So it's not from an ant, but typically it'll be in the flea. So if your animal has a flea, it's going to start biting itself, and so when it bites itself, it probably will eat a flea, and that flea has a flatworm in it. So when the flatworm is in the flea, the dog or cat eats the flea, then that animal, bam, worms, right? And so you have to deworm your animal. So because here in the Rio Grande Valley we have a lot of fleas, we have a lot of worms in the animals, and so just kind of keep that in mind. So same thing, like how this happens is the same with our cats and our dogs here. Commensalism. Let's go ahead and highlight that. So commensalism is when one benefits and then the other is not hurt or benefiting at all. It's like a neutral. So it's like one is benefiting and the other is neutral. So the example they have here is Spanish moss, which we have down here, by the way. It says Spanish moss, an epiphyte that hangs on trees. I don't 100% agree on this. So epiphyte means that it's a plant living on another plant. It's saying that it doesn't hurt the tree, but I feel like if this whole tree was covered in Spanish moss, then it would not be able to photosynthesize as well. So, I mean, I don't really agree with that example, but I guess. So that's benefiting and neutral. That's commensalism. It says predation reduces competition, and the example is that starfish eat barnacles, allowing other species to thrive instead of being crowded out by the explosive population of barnacles. So that's the checks and balances system. A keystone species, really good term. All right. A species whose effects on the composition of communities are greater than one might expect based on their abundance. So an example that they have here is like beavers. So you wouldn't think, right, because they're so small. If you've ever seen a beaver before, they're not that large. But they can change a whole waterway, right, with cutting down the trees and blocking the water. And so that's why we consider them to be a keystone species. They can really change up a habitat. Another good example, there's elephants. Elephants are really like, and I'm thinking of elephants, Indian elephants, the ones that are in the rainforest. The same way, they're so strong, they can tear down trees and really change a habitat or an environment to make room for other species. And so they're also a really good example of a keystone species. And here they give you, look, there's a great picture. It says beavers construct dams and transform flowing streams into ponds, creating new habitats for many plants and animals. So that's what we call a keystone species. Succession and disturbance. Let's go ahead and highlight. So there's two types of successions. There's what we call primary and secondary succession. It's kind of like a reset button, right? And it's typically done by something really tragic sometimes. And so let's kind of show you some examples. So primary succession is when you have something change the environment relatively quickly. It could be a fire. There was a forest fire. It burned down all of the trees. And so now what you'll see is you'll have a lot of new growth in trees. Another example of primary succession can be a flood. It also can wipe down trees and make room for new trees. When you have what's called the secondary succession, which here it is, they're a little bit different. So primary succession would be like that the soil is taken away. It wipes out everything. So actually a fire really couldn't do that, but a flood could. And by a flood, I mean something like a really, probably like a monsoon type of flooding, or maybe a massive hurricane, something that is so strong that it takes out the soil and kind of leaves like a bare rock. And so that then you'll see a lot of things like lichens coming up to break down the rock and turn it into soil. So that's primary succession. Secondary is when the soil is still there. So the fire is a good example for secondary succession. So I'm going to go ahead and add here, insert, removes soil. extreme, let's put natural disaster. Example, monsoon, tsunami, something like that. All right, so removes the soil and you have to start from scratch. Secondary is going to take less time for it to come back. So something like a fire is a good example. A flood that's not as drastic as a tsunami or a monsoon. Another good example with this could be like a volcano, right? Because a volcano will pretty much melt anything. So that's another good example. And so those are the differences, primary and secondary succession. And so disturbance, why is it important? We already mentioned that it can kind of, it's like a reset button, and so it really can be a good thing. Now, if you're having disturbances very frequently, then that's kind of an issue, right? The plants or animals are not really having an opportunity to come back. But disturbance actually is something that is good and it's natural, in moderation, I would say. But it says disturbance is common rather than exceptional in many communities. Understanding the role that disturbances play in structuring communities is an important area of ecology. So disturbance is a good thing, unless it's happening very, very frequently. We're on to our last chapter. This is chapter 57, the biosphere and human impacts. So the biosphere is all living communities on Earth. Global patterns of life on Earth are influenced by the amount of solar radiation and patterns of the global atmospheric circulation, which also influences the ocean. And so this picture just kind of shows you why it's hotter and colder in certain places. How the water moves throughout the planet, that you have warmer waters and colder waters, and how that influences everything. Also, this is very much what we learned in elementary, right? How the rain is able to come out of the clouds once it hits a mountain. You may remember this from your childhood, so it still stands true. That is how it works. It's not always how it works. You can have influences. But it says rain shadows. The rain falls as air rises, remains dry on the leeward side of the mountain. So typically you're going to have a lot more rain near the ocean. So like us, we do live relatively close to the ocean. And so we have, specifically for the Rio Grande Valley, we have summers that are typically very wet. That's when hurricane season is. And so we have a lot of water during the summer months, and then we have a dry winter. And so we will have a lot of wildfires. I'm not sure if you hear on the news, but typically in the winter here in the Rio Grande Valley is when we have a lot of wildfires, because we have a dry season during the winter months. And so understanding that is kind of cool. Like I always hear people say like, man, it rains so much this summer. And it's like, guys, it rains this much every summer. So now that you know that, try and remember every summer, I promise you're going to notice that there's a lot of rain. Elevation also is a big influence. It says elevation, temperature, and other conditions change with elevation. So it's much colder at a higher elevation than it would be at a lower elevation. You can also have what's called microclimates. So that it's just a climate that is in a small area. And actually, we need to go over this word because I don't think they have gone over it. And so the difference between climate and weather. So weather is something that is daily, and climate is something on average that is yearly. So climate is long term, and weather is day to day. And so microclimates is an example could be gaps in a forest canopy or under a log in a forest. So that's what we consider to be microclimates. Now the biomes, you have a few of these on your exam, and so you'll need to remember them. So biomes, a major type of ecosystem on land, and then we'll show you the different types of biomes. There's 8 principal biomes with 6 others. And it says that each biome has a characteristic appearance defined largely by sets of regional climatic conditions, and they're named according to their vegetational structures. And so where the biomes are on the earth, so you kind of can see them and they have them labeled down here. Let's see, where are we? It looks like we're like this yellow and orange. So we have the chaparral and then the temperate grasslands is what it looks like that we are. So very interesting. So let's go over the first one, the tropical rainforest. There's lots of rainfall. There's a picture of it, very, very green. What's interesting about the tropical rainforest is it has a high biodiversity, but it has really nutrient poor soils, and you wouldn't think that. You would think that a place like this, that nutrients are very high, but they actually have a very low nutrient soil. And mostly it's because everything is used for the most part above ground. Like nothing gets wasted in this ecosystem. It's very interesting. But it says the richest ecosystem on land. So it has the highest biodiversity and it's the richest ecosystem. It's very hot and it rains a lot. And it says here, very high diversity, 1,200 species of butterflies in a square mile. Savannas. Hold on really quickly. Let's go back to the amount of rain. So tropical rainforest is 140 to 450 centimeters. Contrasted with this, savanna is 50 to 125 centimeters. So it still gets a decent amount of rain. I mean, it doesn't get a lot of rain by any means compared to the rainforest, but it does get some rain. And so this is what a savanna looks like. I'm sure you've kind of seen this in movies possibly, but that's a savanna. Deserts. Most pictures of deserts are just like that. It just has sand, which is not true. Deserts, they have a lot of diversity. Obviously not as much as like the rainforest, but it does have quite a few very interesting and beautiful species. Like this is a beautiful photo, right? And so look, 25 to 40 centimeters of rainfall, so significantly less. The water rainfall is unpredictable. Plants and animals cannot depend on any rainfall, so these have to be able to live without rain. Oh my gosh, I couldn't even imagine. Vegetation is sparse and the animals are adapted to little water availability. So that's a desert. Temperate grasslands or prairies, probably one of my favorites. They have really nutrient-rich soils. The grass has roots that penetrate deep into the soil. In North America, we converted all of it, for the most part, to agriculture. Why? Because the soils were very nutrient-rich. So it's kind of sad that we did that, but you know, that's what happened. So again, that was the temperate grasslands and prairies. Moving on to temperate forests and the taiga. So we have the deciduous forests, and then we have evergreen forests, and then the taiga and the tundra. So these are much colder climates. And deciduous means that the leaves fall. So the trees that you see like that it loses all its leaves, those are what we call deciduous forests. Evergreens, that they're always green, and then the taiga and the tundra. You see this a lot in upper Russia area is where that would be. It's very cold areas. So let's move on to the freshwater habitats. So freshwater is only 2% of the Earth's surface, so actually very, very small, and we rely on it a lot. So life depends on oxygen availability, and then it kind of talks about the dependence on that. So here it says that oxygen is added by photosynthesis and aeration from the atmosphere. Oxygen is removed by animal and detrivore respiration and through decaying organic matter. And I'm going to give you a little bit examples of that. So we have a lake, which is fresh water. And so there's different zones. And so what's important here, I guess, to remember is that the plants are here, right? They're here in like the I don't know if you would call this the kind of like a shore, because it's not a beach, but I've heard of people calling it that. But so you'll have plants here, and so what the plants are doing is they're able to photosynthesize because they're still able to get the sun. If you had plants down here, not as much sun is able to penetrate, and so they would not be able to photosynthesize. So that's why the plants are here, because they're still able to photosynthesize. And so then they will add oxygen into the lake. So animals like fish that live here have a lot of really good oxygen they do need oxygen. I'm not sure if people realize that, but they do need oxygen. So if there's no oxygen in the water, all the fish are going to die. And so having this healthy system is really important. Oligotrophic oligotrophic lakes. It looks like in Canada is where you would find this. And so the water is like crystal clear and it's like beautiful. And so you think that it's healthy, but it's actually really, really low in nutrients, right? You wouldn't think that. But so that's what that kind of water is. So it's low in nutrients and it's high in oxygen. Crystal clear conditions, light penetrates deep in the water column. So light is able to go really, really far in these lakes. Now, eutrophic lakes are high in nutrients, and because they have such high nutrients, they have what's called like algae blooms, which is not good. So what will happen is that these algae will cover the lake, and so now it says that there's low dissolved oxygen in the summer. It's kind of blocking the system. So anything that is under, like that is supposed to photosynthesize, the sun is not able to penetrate through. So the plants that live here cannot photosynthesize, therefore there is not a lot of oxygen in here. So that's because of this top layer. That happens here also in the Rio Grande Valley. There's some plants that do this. It's one of the plants is called, I believe it's water hyacinth, and it grows on top of the river. And man, what are they called over there by Browns or Rasacas, on top of the Rasacas, and so those are also susceptible to having low oxygen levels. Estuaries. Estuaries are where the fresh water meets the ocean. We have that here in the Rio Grande Valley. We have the Rio Grande River that meets the ocean, and so that's an estuary. And so they have a really, really unique habitat. And so here in the Rio Grande Valley, we do have mangroves. We don't have mangrove. I wouldn't call them swamps, but we do have mangroves, salt marshes, and so very important system, and we'll go over why. It says that they're subjected to severe eutrophication, which could be like the algae blooms, and that's because what could happen is that, let's say, there is a lot of businesses that are along the river and they kind of dump when they shouldn't be, and so it's adding this extra nutrients that shouldn't be there, and so you'll have the eutrophication, which is the algae blooms. So it could disturb them, which it could hurt the salt marshes. And so what will happen is if you don't have a salt marsh, you kind of lose this protected barrier. And so when there's a severe storm like hurricane, that hurricane is going to just hit the mainland. Whereas before, it would have like a buffer zone. It would hit these mangroves first or salt marshes, and so it wouldn't really hit the mainland as hard. And so that's why these ecosystems are extremely important. They're also important because they provide nesting grounds. A lot of animals like fish, sharks, I'm trying to think of anything else, they like to nest in these areas because when the baby is either born or hatches, it's a much more sheltered place than just the like open ocean. Banks and coral reefs. Banks are local shallow areas. Coral reefs occur in subtropical and tropical latitudes. We don't have coral reefs here, but we have them in the Caribbean area. In Mexico, you can see them. Belize, they're also there. They're also going down in numbers because of the rising temperatures in the ocean. So they are animals, remember? We did mention that they are animals. Cnidarians is the phylum. Human impacts on pollution can have really adverse changes in ecosystems. An example that they gave here is DDT, which is something that we used in World War II. And so it had a really harmful impact on our bald eagles. Right. So what happened was that harmful chemical DDT was it what's the word I want to use? No. Well, anyways, it got in the water. DDT was in the water, and so what it did was it kind of was able to get inside of the fish because the fish live in the water. And so the fish would get caught by the bald eagle. The bald eagle would eat them. And then when the bald eagle would have her eggs, they were so thin that she would just sit on them and they would break. And so what we saw was a decline in the bald eagle population. And so because that's the United States bird, we actually took action on it. Maybe if it hadn't been our, our national bird, we wouldn't have. But that was the reason why. Was the what was her name? Her name was Rachel Carson. She is the one that wrote a book about it. It's called Silent Spring, and she talks about all of this. But yeah, so that's an influence that humans can have on an ecosystem, which is kind of like a chain thing, right? You wouldn't think that it would hurt this bird, but because that bird eats the fish and the fish eats probably a plant, and you just kind of had this chain effect. Deforestation and what it could do. So the biggest, I will say probably the biggest threat to animal species, if so, if not the biggest threat, then it is the biggest threat. It would be loss of habitat loss. Once an animal doesn't have its habitat, it can't nest anywhere and have its babies. It can't eat because it doesn't have a place to eat. So habitat loss is the biggest threat to species. And I have a picture of a ruby-throated hummingbird because here in the Rio Grande Valley, we have these, but they have really been hurt by habitat loss. I want to say I was speaking to Tony Hennehan, which is with Texas Parks and Wildlife. He's a biologist, and specifically he is really interested in hummingbirds, and he does a lot of research on them. And so he says that it's equivalent to like if for humans, if you had like a whole classroom, right, of you and your students, if you all just had to be in one corner of the classroom, right? That's all that you could be. You couldn't be anywhere else in the classroom. You just had to be in that corner, all of you. And that's where you had to eat and live and all of that. And so that's like what it's like for these hummingbirds, that they've lost so much habitat. And so I wanted to give that example to you to kind of keep that in mind. So other things that can happen because of deforestation, it says acid rain, disruption in the water cycle, loss of nutrients in the soil, increased desertification. So those are some. Let's moving on to the greenhouse effect. So it says CO2 and other gases which absorb the longer wavelengths of infrared light and radiated heat from the earth are responsible for causing the greenhouse effect. So what's supposed to happen is when the sun hits the earth, that it kind of bounces back. But because of all of these gases that we're releasing into the atmosphere, the sun will hit the earth and then it just kind of, the heat stays there. And so that will warm the planet. And so that's what the greenhouse effect is. And so that's caused because of CO2 and other gases. So the other gases are going to be things like methane. Methane comes out of different places, but one that people have talked about is in the ruminants of mammals. So mammals that are ruminants, this would be like a cow. So if you are somebody that eats cow meat, that is a big contribution to methane gas, because these animals, they're so big, right? I don't even know how much a cow weighs, but they're large, they're huge. And so anytime that they defecate, like poop or fart, anything like that, they release that gas. And so if you're kind of eating these animals, you're paying to eat steak and burgers and all of that. You're really contributing to the methane gas going into the atmosphere. So I wanted to bring that into light because that's something that most people are not aware of. And because of that, right, methane is much worse than CO2. It says methane is 20 times right more powerful at heat trapping than CO2. So it's way more harmful. So if you are eating meat and you want to be more environmentally conscious, I would remove the cow meat off your plate. And so what methane can do is it could really hurt permafrost. And we're seeing this already. What permafrost is like frozen soil, really cold areas like northern Russia, I mentioned before. Um, so methane is already, it's trapped in here, frozen, but once the permafrost melts, and it's not supposed to melt, but if it's melting because of the greenhouse effect, all the methane that is trapped is now getting released. And so we are saying that the permafrost is melting because of our practices here on the planet, and it's something that is irreversible. The permafrost, if it's already melted, that's irreversible. So that's also something that is really, really scary. So I wanted to bring that into light. Some more issues with warming could be like the range of animals. So it says that the rate of warming could be rapid, but also, this is the one, species shift to higher altitudes may have reached the peak of the mountain. Species habitat disappears entirely, so they're losing their where they're supposed to live, basically, is what that's saying. How this can influence agriculture. If there's more CO2, plants really like that, right? So they can grow more. But some cons to that is that there can be more pollen, and so people will have a lot more allergies. You could also have more droughts and decrease in crop production in tropical areas. The effects on humans, you'll have the sea levels rising, increased flooding, which we're seeing that already. Coastal cities and entire islands could be submerged. This is a photo from South Padre Island. And so if you notice, this is very helpful, right, that you have this because it kind of protects the mainland. But this is not very tall. So if you have constant but waves coming and hitting this, right, once it hits this, it takes some back. So if it keeps hitting and taking some back, keep hitting and taking some back, this line of defense will soon be gone, and then you'll have more flooding. And so that's something very scary to think about. And we're on to our last slide, implications for human health. If you have frequent flooding, you'll have less safe drinking water. You can have cholera, that's hard for me to pronounce, and other epidemics may occur more often. You can have diseases, so diseases that are only found in certain climates can now migrate, because if it's warmer in, I don't know, let's say it's in the RGV, that there is a disease in the RGV and it's very warm here, but Michigan is like, oh, it's not going to come here because we're a lot colder. But if you have this climate change occurring, it very much happened that Michigan isn't going to stay cold very long, and now those diseases that thrive here can thrive over there. And so that's kind of what they want to reiterate. And so that's it. That is the review for exam 4, and best of luck to you all. Let me know if you have any questions.